They didn't pass a law. They didn't file a trade complaint. They didn't need a government to act. Ordinary Canadian consumers walked into their local liquor stores, looked at the shelves stacked with American whiskey, and made a choice. And that choice, bottle by bottle, bar by bar, just brought one of America's most iconic industries to its knees. If you think this is just a story about tariffs, stay with me. Because what actually happened here is something far more dangerous, far more permanent, and far more fascinating than any trade policy headline you've seen. And the number at the center of this story is so extreme that the first time I read it, I genuinely thought it was a typo. In the second quarter of 2025, U.S. spirits exports to Canada collapsed by 85%. Not declined, not softened, collapsed. That is a near total erasure of the most important international relationship American whiskey had ever built. Before any of this began, Canada wasn't just another export market. It was the anchor. From 2022 through 2024, Canada absorbed roughly 35% of all U.S. wine exports, more than 15% of U.S. beer exports, and as much as 13% of U.S. distilled spirits exports. American distillers could count on Canada the way you count on a clock. Reliable, familiar, always there. And then, in the span of a few months, it was gone. Total U.S. alcohol exports to Canada fell from $744 million to just $28 million. That's $536 million in vanished revenue. Not redirected, not absorbed domestically, just gone. Wiped out because citizens with smartphones started filming themselves pulling American bottles off shelves and posting it for the world to see. If that number didn't stop you, hit pause and read it again. Now keep watching because the worst part of this story hasn't started yet. To understand how a consumer boycott achieved what governments usually can't, you have to go back to early 2025. In March, the Trump administration placed a 25% tariff on Canadian exports. Canada retaliated with its own 25% tariff on American goods. Canadian politicians threatened to pull American alcohol from government-run liquor store shelves entirely. That threat was not a bluff. It was executed with surgical precision. The British Columbia government directed its state-run liquor stores to stop purchasing American spirits from certain states immediately. Ontario's LCBO, one of the single largest purchasers of alcohol anywhere on the planet, pulled thousands of American products from its shelves virtually overnight. What had been a routine commercial relationship became, in a matter of days, a geopolitical statement. But here is what nobody in the American spirits industry had adequately prepared for. The consumers didn't need to be told twice. They were already ready. And the reason they chose bourbon as the battlefield is not random. It is strategic, and it is brilliant. Subscribe if you want to keep understanding stories the mainstream news glosses over. We break this down fresh every day. Bourbon is not just a drink in the American South. It is identity. It is Kentucky. It is family farms, generational craft, small towns with names that don't appear on major maps, and a culture that sees itself as the backbone of America. By targeting bourbon specifically, Canada wasn't attacking a product category. It was attacking a symbol. And that strategic precision landed with devastating effect. Viral videos spread across social media showing liquor store employees physically wheeling carts of Jack Daniels and Maker's Mark into back storage rooms, not just leaving them unsold, but visibly, dramatically ejecting them. That image was not accidental. It was a message, and it circulated with the velocity of something that tells a story too perfectly to ignore. Trump's rhetoric about Canada becoming the 51st state had already transformed what might have been a manageable trade dispute into a matter of national dignity. Canadians were not simply annoyed about tariffs. They were insulted. And in that emotional context, buying American bourbon stopped feeling like a consumer preference and started feeling like an act of surrender. That kind of motivation, pride, identity, solidarity, is not extinguished when a tariff expires. And that is the part of this story that should be keeping American distillery executives awake at 3 in the morning. Because what came next wasn't just a revenue problem. It was a structural collapse. Brown-Forman, the parent company of Jack Daniels and Woodford Reserve, one of the most storied spirits corporations in the world, reported that sales to Canada dropped 62% during its latest fiscal quarter compared to the year before. The company's CEO acknowledged on an earnings call that the dispute had created significant headwinds, noting that non-U.S. brands in their portfolio continued to grow, but couldn't come close to offsetting the destruction of their American whiskey business in Canada. That is a remarkable public admission. But Brown-Forman's damage, as severe as it is not the most dramatic corporate consequence of this story. That distinction belongs to Jim Beam. Jim Beam, one of the largest American whiskey makers on earth, announced it will halt all production at its Claremont, Kentucky distillery for the full year of 2026. Not slow production, not reduce shifts, halt completely. The Claremont facility is not a satellite operation. It is the beating heart of Jim Beam's production. Shutting it down for a year is not a cautious adjustment. It is a declaration that demand has fallen so far that making whiskey no one will buy in the near term makes no financial sense. Bulleit's parent company also temporarily halted production at its Lebanon, Kentucky site in 2025. These are not panicked short-term decisions. These are companies recalibrating their entire production strategies for a future that looks nothing like the past. And here is the part of this story that most coverage completely misses. Stay with me, because this is where the real long-term damage lives. Kentucky's bourbon industry supports over 22,500 jobs and generates $9 billion annually for the state's economy. This is not a boutique artisan market. It is a $9 billion economic engine employing farmers who grow the corn, coopers who build the barrels, truckers who haul the product, and hospitality workers who serve the bourbon tourists who come from around the world. And because of bourbon's fundamental nature, it must be aged for years before it can be sold. Distilleries can't simply switch production on and off like a factory making phones. Every barrel filled today is a bet on what the market will look like in 3, 5, sometimes 10 years. When you destroy market demand this suddenly and this severely, you don't just create a short-term revenue crisis. You create a long-term production planning catastrophe that echoes for decades. Kentucky whiskey exports fell around 28% in the first half of 2025 compared to the year prior. Exports of used bourbon barrels, sold to Irish, Scottish, and Japanese distillers to age their own spirits, fell 29% across the first 10 months of 2025. U.S. production of distilled spirits overall dropped 28% during the first 8 months of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. Every layer of the supply chain is bleeding. And the worst part, the part that turns a crisis into a catastrophe, is what was happening on the Canadian side of the border at exactly the same moment. Because Canada didn't stop drinking, not even close. This is the twist that changes everything about how you understand this story. While American bourbon was being physically removed from Canadian shelves, Canadian consumers were not going sober. They were discovering something. In Quebec, sales of Canadian spirits rose 15% between early March and mid-August, compared to the same period the year before. Canadian whiskey grew by 35% over the past 6 months. Rum sales surged 50% as consumers shifted from Bacardi, an American distributed brand, to Captain Morgan, which is Canadian. Ontario-made spirits saw a 4.5% sales boost between February and September 2025. Alberta-made spirits surged 13% over the same period. And here is the number that, when you truly absorb it, reframes this entire story. The LCBO reported its first quarter sales hit $1.67 billion, virtually identical to the $1.66 billion recorded the year before. The money didn't leave the market. American distillers lost the revenue. Canadian and international producers captured every dollar of it. One Canadian producer nearly tripled its sales since the beginning of the year. American wine's share of all imported wine in Canada fell from 21% in 2024 to just 5% in 2025. U.S. distilled spirits fell from 24% of the Canadian import market to just 10%. And craft distilleries that most Canadians had never seriously considered, Quebec's first grain-to-bottle operation, Okanagan Spirits in British Columbia, Spring Mill in Ontario, Bridgeland in Alberta, are attracting a scale of consumer attention they have never seen before. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Canadian whiskey can actually hold this ground once American bourbon comes back? Because the answer to that question is where this story gets genuinely complicated. Rye whiskeys like Lot 40 and Alberta Premium have surged. Legacy bourbon drinkers in Canada are discovering that Canadian whiskeys with corn-heavy recipes provide a flavor profile similar enough to what they loved that switching doesn't feel like settling. Bartenders and sommeliers across the country are building Canadian whiskey knowledge they never had before. Not because it's trendy, but because they have to. Their customers are asking for it. Their suppliers are pushing it. Their menus require it. And here is the insight that cuts deepest into the long-term future of this industry. When the bartender stops recommending your product and starts recommending someone else's, you don't have a trade dispute problem. You have a brand relationship problem. And that doesn't get fixed by a tariff rollback. It gets fixed, if it gets fixed at all, through years of renewed presence, re-education, re-relationship building at the most granular level of the hospitality industry. The spirits category director at SAQ, Quebec's government liquor authority, said plainly that the whiskey category will likely be permanently impacted because people have discovered Canadian whiskey and more Scotch. Not temporarily disrupted, permanently impacted. That is a government liquor authority official saying out loud that Canadian consumer behavior has shifted in ways that will outlast the political dispute that caused it. And none of this exists in a vacuum, because the Canadian crisis didn't arrive in a healthy market. It hit an industry that was already showing serious strain. American whiskey's explosive growth period, which ran from roughly 2019 through 2021, had already moderated before 2025. Volume growth had turned slightly negative by 2024. Distilleries had massively expanded capacity during the pandemic boom years, and by 2025, many were already managing inventory concerns and production overruns. The Canadian boycott didn't create that fragility, it detonated it. And then there is the political irony at the center of this entire story. The irony that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The tariffs imposed on Canada were designed, in theory, to protect and benefit American industry. And yet one of the most direct and measurable consequences of those tariffs has been the near destruction of one of America's most genuinely successful and globally respected export industries. Kentucky is not a blue state. Its political leadership has generally been aligned with the administration that created this trade dispute. The sight of a conservative-leaning state's signature $9 billion industry being dismantled by the trade policies of a conservative administration through a boycott fueled by Canadian national pride is one of the most striking political economy stories in recent American history. One Kentucky congressman described the uncertainty in the market in terms that left no room for optimism. Exports to Canada and the European Union, two of bourbon's largest international markets, were down 42% and 13% respectively in the January through October 2025 period. The headwinds are not coming from one direction. They are coming from everywhere at once. So what actually happens next? The most optimistic path forward for American bourbon runs through a swift and comprehensive resolution of the broader trade dispute. Normalized tariffs, American spirits returning to Canadian shelves, brand loyalty reasserting itself, and a gradual market recovery over 2 to 3 years. That path is not impossible. Bourbon has a structural protection no Canadian producer can replicate. Legal definition. Bourbon must be made in America. You cannot produce a genuine domestic substitute. And Canadian consumers who genuinely love bourbon will not be permanently satisfied by a Canadian alternative, no matter how good that alternative has become. There is strong, documented demand for bourbon in Ontario and across Canada. That demand has not disappeared, it has been suppressed. But the more sober and probably more accurate scenario is a partial and slow recovery that looks nothing like a return to 2024 levels. Canadian consumers who spent 2025 discovering Lot 40, Crown Royal XR, or an Okanagan craft expression will keep buying those products, not instead of bourbon forever, but alongside it, in proportions that leave American brands permanently smaller than they were. Market share that took a decade of aggressive marketing to build does not come back in a single holiday shopping season. And if the trade relationship remains volatile, if tariffs cycle on and off the way trade disputes between these two countries have historically tended to do, the uncertainty itself becomes a deterrent. Canadian retailers and liquor boards making long-term purchasing commitments to American brands will factor that volatility into every decision they make. For everyone watching who works in the spirits industry, invests in it, follows it, or simply loves bourbon, the analytical conclusions here are unavoidable. The speed with which a major export market can evaporate when political conditions turn hostile has now been demonstrated at a scale the industry had never seen before. Canada went from accounting for 35% of American wine exports and 13% of spirits exports to near total collapse in weeks. Scenario planning that most companies in this sector hadn't done with sufficient rigor is now a business survival requirement. Canadian whiskey is no longer the affordable, overlooked default. Customers are actively trading up to super premium and deluxe Canadian whiskey brands at price points that match American whiskey, which changes the commercial viability of the entire Canadian spirits sector permanently. And perhaps most importantly, this story proves that when a consumer boycott is culturally resonant, emotionally grounded, and practically convenient, when it feels like an act of identity rather than a sacrifice, it can achieve economic damage that rivals government intervention. No Canadian law forced anyone to stop buying Jack Daniels. Consumers made that choice freely, in their millions, because it felt like the right thing to do. And the civic energy that drove that choice is not something a trade agreement, a marketing campaign, or a celebrity endorsement can simply switch back off. The bourbon industry has survived before. It survived Prohibition. It survived the whiskey glut of the 1970s and 80s, when vodka took over American palates and distilleries shuttered in droves. It survived the EU retaliatory tariffs of 2018 and ultimately came back stronger. The resilience of this industry across a century of disruption is not in question. What this year has forced the entire industry, and anyone paying attention, to confront is a harder question. Whether the relationships, the markets, and the trust that bourbon spent decades carefully constructing across international borders can be taken for granted. Whether the liquid aging in those charred oak barrels is somehow insulated from the politics of the world above. The answer, delivered in the form of 85% export collapses, shuttered distilleries, $536 million in erased trade, and a generation of Canadian bartenders now fluent in domestic alternatives, is definitively and painfully no. The golden liquid ages in silence. But the world it wakes up into has already moved on, and the ordinary Canadian standing in that liquor store aisle, deciding between the bottle with the maple leaf and the one with the Kentucky stamp, is making a choice that no diplomat, no trade negotiator, and no distillery executive can make for them. Right now, in greater numbers than at any point in history, they are reaching for the maple leaf. That shift, quiet, personal, one bottle at a time, may turn out to be the most consequential trade story of this decade. We track every development in this story daily. Share this with someone who thinks tariffs are just an abstract policy debate, because here is what they actually look like on the ground. If you want analysis like this delivered to you before anyone else has it, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it might be the most useful 2 seconds of your day.